Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. I hope some of you are from small organisations. This session was slightly misbilled originally. I'll go into that in a minute. Anyway, just to say, my name's Jess Carhill. I'm an accessibility and usability consultant here at AbilityNet. So I spend my days testing websites, mobile apps, to see if they are accessible, and also doing training and user research, that kind of thing. Um, just to go through quickly what we are going to talk about today. This is a very brief overview of how to implement accessibility if you're in a small organization where you've got very limited time, money, and staff. So this is a really cut down version, but it's also a really high level overview of the kind of things you need to think about if you're going to implement accessibility. So even if you're in a larger organization, perhaps if you're just starting to think about accessibility, this is potentially a pretty good overview of the things you need to think about. Um, this looks at things that are common issues, fairly easy to address, not too time consuming, don't require a developer. If you follow all the advice in this session, you probably won't be 100% accessible, but you will have made a really good start. You'll be well on your way. What it isn't is a guide to how to do accessibility on the cheap if you're part of a large organization that just doesn't want to invest in it. Um, yes, known as accessibility on a shoestring. This is cut down from a webinar, which is an hour and a half. I referred to it to my boss the other day accidentally as shoehorn, which I think was a Freudian slip because even the original version had an awful lot of content shoehorned into it. And this is now half the length, so even more highly condensed. And I will regularly be saying we've got a whole webinar on this because, as I say, it's a super high level view that doesn't go into the details very much. There is an opportunity to ask questions at the end. Do feel free to pop questions in the chat or the Q&A feature, or we can unmute at the end and just discuss things. So just hopefully you know what accessibility is. But in this context, really just to say what we're looking at is the ability for anyone, including disabled people, to access websites, apps, digital documents, digital services and processes. And to be certain that people who use assistive technology like screen readers, magnifiers, and alternative input mechanisms, like using a switch rather than a mouse, all of these things work with your digital products. This is backed up by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and if you were at the morning sessions, you'll know that there was some legislation involved, mostly for small organisations. This won't be relevant unless you're in the public sector. So the kind of things that small organisations may face are lack of staff time, lack of knowledge, lack of budget. You know, you may have a very small staff who are all wearing lots of different hats because they have to do so many things, manage the website, the social media, the magazine. I'm talking from personal experience here. And you end up knowing a little bit about a lot of things rather than rather than having in-depth knowledge. So you may find that you have very stretched resources, but not being able to do everything doesn't mean that you shouldn't do anything. So you need to think about how you can have the biggest impact. So one metaphor might be, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. You have to start small. And when you really don't know where to start, the most important thing is just to start. So the first thing to look at is sort of from the top down, management and finance. How do we make sure that we can actually do accessibility? So we need to make sure that there's a commitment to accessibility in internal policies and in strategy. If you're hiring people, make sure that their job descriptions include accessibility. So ideally, you can take on people who are going to bring in some knowledge to the organization. You want to make sure that if you're allocating time for tasks, that you're including some time for people to make sure that things are accessible as they go. Budgets take account of any additional costs of implementing accessibility. Your staff have got at least some basic accessibility training. If you're, say, a charity or you're working up a budget, you want to make sure that your funding applications include things like accessibility testing and any other accessibility work, including training, that needs to happen to make sure your product's accessible. So when should you think about accessibility? And these are some fairly key points. So we've talked about strategy and policy. So when you're doing creating or reviewing strategy and policy, style and brand guidelines, that's a really good place to think about things like accessible colors and fonts. Any project planning for new websites or new components, new digital services. If you're writing new content, if you're updating any old content, it's a good opportunity to check the accessibility of the existing content. If you're adding any images or multimedia or extra widgets to your website, you need to think about accessibility then. So making sure that you're adding alternative text to images, captions for any multimedia, for any videos particularly, making sure that any new widgets are accessible. And also, if you're training and doing induction with new staff, we need to make sure that there is accessibility taken into account at this point. So, uh, one of the things we do have a whole sort of service on how to, yes. So one of the things to say also is I will be saying at regular intervals, we have a whole webinar on this because it is such a high level view. And we have both a webinar on this and also a whole service about how to implement accessibility into your business as usual, into your management. So we've got the disability accessibility maturity model, for example. Um, if we think about procurement, this is pretty key and actually can be one of the trickier areas. We need to make sure that if we're procuring products, choosing products, that we're thinking about accessibility when we do that. So if we're commissioning new websites or apps, if we're adding any website plugins, if we're making choices around social media, if we're thinking about what document types we use, or if we're taking on any new internal communications solutions, we want to be sure that these things are all accessible. So you need to know the kind of questions to ask and the kind of considerations that may apply. If it's a website, if you're hiring a developer, what standard are they going to aim to meet? Have they produced accessible websites before? How are they aiming to test them? Those are the kind of questions you might want to ask. If you're signing a contract or creating a contract, is accessibility in the contract? So, this website needs to be accessible. If it's not accessible, then the contract is invalid, etc. If you're uh, taking on a new content management system to manage your website, does it enable you to make content accessible? Does it actually help you, prompt you to make content accessible, or even force you? So, for instance, does it make you put in alternative text for an image, as an example? If you're really small and really skinned and you're building your own website from something like WordPress or Wix or Squarespace, these vary, and also, particularly with WordPress, it can be possible to start with an accessible theme, but then potentially make it inaccessible when you're adding content. So if you're looking at themes, they tend to be described as accessibility ready rather than actually accessible. But yeah, you want to make sure that the overall website of Wix or Squarespace or whatever it might be, make sure that they say, have a look at what they say about accessibility on their website and make sure that you're choosing an accessibility ready theme or template. It certainly used to be the case that Wix and Squarespace accessibility was not great, and I think they're taking this more seriously. It's certainly possible to make a WordPress website accessible. And you also need to think about the accessibility of plugins, add-ons, and third-party extensions. Anything like forms you might be adding or functionality for people to buy things or whatever. We also need to make sure that those are accessible. If you have an existing website and it wasn't produced with accessibility in mind, it's not likely to be accessible. Websites aren't magically accessible by default. And the chances are that if you don't know if your website is accessible, then it probably isn't. But there are some things that you can do to establish this. There's a bit of basic testing, which we'll be looking at later. Content accessibility. So you might be stuck with an inaccessible website, but you can still start with making your new content accessible and work through older content to update it. You can test your third-party plugins, check if these are accessible, consider changing them if they're not for more accessible ones. And you can gather insights towards your next website. So, which are the most popular journeys? What kind of barriers are people facing on your website? And we'll be looking a little bit at how to do some basic user testing later on. So any other platforms that you might be commissioning, thinking of adding, check the supplier's website for an accessibility statement. Generally speaking, if there isn't one, that's kind of a red flag. Some products also may have something called a VPAT, which is an American statement of accessibility, so that's worth looking for. Does the supplier's website say what standards and or legislation it aims to meet if they do have an accessibility statement? If there isn't one, you can always ask for one. Do they have help files on accessibility? So, in their help section, there may be material on how to make the product more accessible. And again, like the content management system, if it's allowing you to create or upload content, then you want to look for something that helps you to be accessible rather than hindering you. So very brief summary of making content accessible on a website. As I say, super high level overview. So if you're adding images to a website, then these need alternative text. And this means that you need to spell out what information the image provides in context. So this is primarily for users of screen readers, which read the page aloud to somebody who isn't able to see it. We need to be sure that the screen reader is able to announce the kind of information that's available in the image. So we've got a pair of shoes here. In different contexts, that image might be doing something slightly different. How precisely do we need to describe these shoes? If this is a product page, we might need to describe them really precisely. Or it might alternatively just be a decorative image, in which case we don't. But yeah, so we need to think about the context that the image is in and describe it briefly. And so this should be, I'll just do a quick demo with our website. So I've set up here a rather random page about the British Shorthair breed. There should be, if you bring up a picture, there should be some kind of field that allows you to put in alternative text in the background. And if it's an image link, so where if you click on the image, it takes you somewhere else, what you want the alternative text to do then is actually to tell you where the link is going. So just to introduce you quickly to a testing tool called Andy. This is a bookmarklet, and it doesn't seem to be working on the Clark's website. Let's try it on the AbilityNet website. Here we go. We can test this, and I'll show you a bit more about Andy later by looking at images, and we can flick through these, and the Andy output here will tell us what each image says. So we can flip through these images in turn, except that there are very few on this page. Let's check another page. Yeah, so anyway, it'll enable you to go through and see what text is being output for each image. And this is a relatively user-friendly tool, which is why I prefer it to some others in this kind of context. The other thing we need to think about is images of text. These aren't accessible to everybody. For instance, a screen reader can't read the text on an image if that text is embedded in it. So we want to avoid images of text, at least don't rely on them to communicate information. We need to make sure that text is also available on the page. It's also not just for screen reader users. If you blow up the image because you're visually impaired and you need it to be bigger, the text doesn't tend to scale properly. It'll end up just sort of pixelating. We also need to think about color contrast. So around 1 in 12 men have are colourblind, have colour vision difference. So it's about around 4.5% of the population. And we need to make sure that there is a contrast of general text with its background of 4.5 to 1, or for large text and graphical elements, 3 to 1. Again, we can test with Andy. Let's bring this back again. So there is a color contrast element here. It brings up some things where we might need to think about contrast. Okay, so it's telling us that text definitely doesn't meet the contrast ratio here. And it's also pointing out some places where we might need to do a manual test. So I'm just going to quickly show a tool called Color Contrast Analyzer. So here what it's picking up is where we've got some inactive tabs that are grayed out, and it doesn't like the look of those. So we can also use this tool, which has a little eyedropper, just to check the text and its background. And again, indeed, this tells us that it fails. So for instance, Andy might be able to flag up some general issues for us to look at, but then Color Contrast Analyzer will definitely be able to tell us whether things pass or not. So rattling through still, use of color. We need to make sure that we're not relying on use of color to provide information. So in the graph on the left, we've got these 3 lines divided that are distinguished only by color, whereas on the right, we've also given them separate data points, different shapes of data points. So the green line, for instance, has square data points, and the yellow one has round ones. So we can then distinguish by shape and not just by color. So for instance, the graph on the left would potentially be quite meaningless to somebody who struggles to tell the difference between the orange and the green. We also need to make sure that we aren't relying on sensory characteristics. So we're not assuming that people can perceive color, shape, location, or sound. And also multimedia, we want to make sure that any video or audio has captions and transcripts. So YouTube is a great tool for auto-generating captions, but you will need to correct those automatic captions because they can still be quite dodgy here and there. And also make sure that you don't set things like video or audio to autoplay when somebody opens the page. Another note about multimedia, moving or flashing content. We need to avoid flashing content altogether. And moving content must have an off button of some kind. So if there's some kind of animation or video on the page, the user needs to be able to pause that or turn it off or hide it. Okay, so website content. So all of the last few slides you can test just by having a look for yourself and checking whether these conditions are met. Website content, we also need to think about how it's structured, so how text is structured and that kind of thing. So if we go back again to our internal content management system, we have got tools here for flagging up, for marking up headings. So if I'm going to make this piece of text distinctive features a heading, I can select different types of styling. So I can make it a heading using these different heading levels. So I'm going to make it a heading level 2. So we want to make sure that we are using these tools properly. If we have headings on the page, we want to mark them up using these headings and not, for example, just by making them bigger, bolder, so that visually they look like headings, but they're not actually marked up as headings in the background. So this applies to headings, lists, and tables. We need to use those kind of formatting tools for their intended purpose. And also not just to position content on the page or make it look a certain way. You know, don't use a heading style just to make something look big and bold. So a lot of this also applies to document content. Again, images need alternative text. You want to use the formatting tools for headings, lists, and tables, and not just to style content. We've also got something called the Office Accessibility Checker. Just run you through this very quickly. It's under review, check accessibility, and this is pretty intuitive. It will automatically test your document and give you a list of things that you may need to address. We advise you to avoid PDFs because it can be tricky to make them accessible. But if you have to, and you're creating the document in Word, then make sure that you've run the accessibility checker, corrected all the issues, and exported it with tags. So under options, there's an option to export the document with tags. Make sure you've done that. But we do advise frequently it's better to have the document just as a web page, a Word document, or possibly an accessible third-party product. So, something like Microsoft Forms or SurveyMonkey, if it's a form, that kind of thing. Social media. So social media platforms tend to work differently and change over time. And again, we've got a whole webinar on this, but you should be able to add alt text, avoid images of text. You may or may not be able to add captions to video. This really varies across platforms. So you probably want to consider using open captions, which are the ones that are burnt in to the video so that you can use the same video on different platforms. And if you're using hashtags, then use a capital letter at the start of each word. So this helps screen readers to pronounce the hashtag correctly rather than just as a mush of letters. So I'm going to pause questions till I've finished the presentation. There is definitely an opportunity to ask questions. Testing. So the most common accessibility issues that we see, this is the result of a survey called the WebAIM 1 Million study. So the most common accessibility issues are insufficient color contrast or using color for meaning, missing alternative text for images, lack of keyboard access, we'll talk about that in a minute, missing focus indicators, again, we'll talk about that in a minute, missing form field labels in inaccessible error messages, which we won't talk about because it's too much to get into in a short session. Incorrect heading structures. For example, you want your heading structure to be rational, as it were, to start with a top level heading of heading level 1, and then go on to a secondary level of heading level 2. Perhaps that has some heading level 3s underneath it, and so on. But we want a logical heading structure. And the final most common accessibility is multimedia lacking captions, transcripts, or audio description. Unfortunately, all of these are quite simple to test. Automated testing is easy and it's generally free, but it may flag up technical issues that you may not know how to address or be able to. But if you do want to do it, then there is something called Lighthouse, which is built into Chrome. And there are free extensions, free axe extensions for the most common browsers. Automated testing also has its limitations. It doesn't it doesn't provide you with a complete test result. It only finds around 30 to 40% of issues. The rest would be you will need to do manual testing to check for. Again, we've got a whole webinar about starting your own testing. So a lot of these things we've already looked at how to test. We skipped headings. I'll just quickly show you how to test for headings. So if we go back to the AbilityNet website and to Andy, we've got in the drop down, we've got something called structures and headings here on the right. And we can open up this headings list and it shows us the heading structure of our page. So we can make sure that the headings are actually correctly describing the content and that the structure is logical. So a quick bit of manual testing that is really pretty easy to do is some keyboard testing. So many people aren't able to use a mouse. This also applies to screen reader users, as well as to people who may, have lack manual dexterity. It's the basis of a lot of accessibility, being able to use just the keyboard. I'm just going to demonstrate quickly on the Clark's website, purely because of the shoe metaphor. So if I press the tab key, I'm just going to click on the tab. Right, so I'm pressing the tab key, and this will take me forwards through each of the interactive elements in turn. And you can see where I am because there's a visible ring around each link or interactive element as I go through. So that's just pressing the tab key. If I want to go backwards, I can hold down Shift and press the tab key. And so I should be able to get into all of the menus, get into the search box. So let's go forward into the search box. So I should then be able to type. Okay, and I can't actually. Yeah, it looks as though potentially the search box interactivity isn't quite working correctly. I should be able to access links. So if I press enter, it should take me to the link. Okay, yep, that does work. So actually, let's go back to women. So I'm just tabbing through. The other thing you'll notice is that the first link is skip to main content, and this skips you over, if you're a keyboard user, skips you over the navigation and takes you further down the page. And that's really useful because you don't want to be continuously having to navigate through the website navigation every time you go to a new page. Anyway, so this is just an example of some very basic keyboard navigation and how you can have a go at this and make sure that you can, using just the tab key and the space or enter key, you should be able to get into and out of and operate everything. And you should always be able to see where you are at all times. So Andy, we've already looked at briefly. Just bring back my window. So yes, we've got the link here. Let me actually just put this into the chat. It is a useful testing tool, particularly where people are not necessarily particularly techy, I would say. Some of the other testing tools can be quite difficult to understand. So I'm just going to put this into the chat. So it's actually just a bookmarklet. It's not an extension. You just drag it into your bookmarks bar. And then it's always there when you need it. So you can use Andy to check that your images have alternative text. As we've seen, you can use it to check that your heading structure is logical and that your headings are actually marked up. Your lists also need to be marked up, and it can check for that. And link text. So we skipped over that. We want to make sure that link text tells you where the link is going. So like, for instance, where you're putting a hyperlink in, Andy will again bring up a list of links so that you can check that they all make sense. And it'll help you to do this first check for color contrast. And also, yeah, the Microsoft Accessibility Checker, which we've already looked at, super useful for Word documents and PowerPoint. There is also something called Grackle Suite for Google Docs. So this is the equivalent, but it is actually paid for and not free. Usability testing. It is super useful to get insight from real people on how well they get on trying to use your website. It is possible to do it on a shoestring. If you want to try and recruit as representative a body of testers as possible. So just the sort of people that you think might be using your website with a sort of a cross section of disabilities across vision, hearing, cognitive impairment, mobility issues. You do need to reward their time, either pay them, or give them a voucher, free access to your services, something like that. Give them a task, such as finding a specific piece of information or completing some kind of transaction on your website, and observe them. Don't prompt them where they have problems, but find out where they get stuck, where things really fail to work for them. And also, don't forget just general website feedback. Make it easy for people to get in touch with you to tell you where your website is inaccessible, and then act on it as well. It can be very difficult to know how to prioritize accessibility. So there are various ways that you can go about this, and it's really dependent, on what matters to you. But you could prioritize accessibility issues by importance. So the most critical or important journeys through your website, or the most important digital services you provide, or the pages on your website that get the highest traffic, or your most popular product. So you could do those things first, or you could do the most common issues first. So this would be things like headings being misused, for example. If this happens globally, and also have a think about why it's common. Do your staff need more training or a process to follow? So that could be something to prioritize. Um, Severity, you might also want to prioritize things in order of severity, starting with complete blockers. So, for instance, if people can't get through your homepage because there's a problem with keyboard access, so they literally can't get beyond your homepage, that would be pretty severe. Perhaps you might want to deal with those things first. Or alternatively, you might want to just start with the low-hanging fruit and the things that are easiest to fix. Uh, this can be encouraging to start with sort of easy wins. There's something called the snowball theory of technical debt, where you start with the easy things. It's more encouraging and helps you to sort of get on with things and make progress. Okay, so I have done an absolutely whistle-stop tour of accessibility for small organisations. So do fire away with your questions, and I'm just going to have a look back through the chat and see what people have brought up. Okay, so we had a question about procurement. We keep being told the vendor or product is WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 compliant, and that ticks the box. In reality, I find a lot of even 2.1 compliant systems are not great and don't meet all accessibility needs. Any advice on a list of tests that need to be sent to vendors as part of procurement functional needs to be accessible? Oh, that's a tricky one. I might have to go away and think about that one. I'll come back to that one. Usability testing. What is your opinion on unmoderated user testing where there is a lack of budget, time, and resources? I would say it's going to be better than doing none. I think it is really helpful to observe people trying to use your website and failing. So I think it's one of the things that really affects hearts and minds. We really see that people watching somebody struggling to use their website, can be really motivated to make accessibility improvements on that after that. But, if unmoderated is the easiest way forward for you, then go for it. As I say, it's better than none. Moving content should have an off option. Does that include transitions from slide to slide in a presentation? This is a really good question. So I looked into this. The actual requirement is that applies to content that moves for a certain amount of time. And so this is one of the things that actually affects me. I'm very sensitive to visual movement. It can give me migraines, dizziness, make me very ill at times. So I looked into it quite closely, and I found that all of the kind of animation types in a PowerPoint presentation are underneath that time threshold. So technically it does pass. However, what I would say is it's really better not to use those kind of transitions, particularly because you're going to be doing that quite a lot over the course of a presentation. So I would say particularly don't use the sort of side to side or up and down ones because it can make people feel quite disorientated. Things that sort of appear that fade in and out is probably better. So technically, you can pass WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, using any of the animated transitions in PowerPoint. But for I would say best practice is not to use the animated transitions, anything that sort of moves from side to side, but use the fade in and out ones. Wave. Yes, Liam, that's a good question. I also have used Wave. I personally don't find it very intuitive. If you do, then great, have a go. Effectively. It's worth trying a few to check which kind of tools you get on with. What is the standard for accessibility for small organisations? Well, this is a good question, and there isn't one effectively. I mean, the standard is the same as for everybody else, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. What I would say is that it's not necessarily a legal requirement in this country. Although the Equality Act probably applies. So if you're providing a service, you need to make sure that people can access it, possibly in an alternative way. Um, in terms of the European Accessibility Act, that doesn't apply to very small organisations. I forget exactly what the threshold is, but if you're a small owner-operated business, it's certainly not going to apply to you. On the clock's website, when navigating the menu with keyboard, the space key seems functionally equivalent to hovering over the menu items, brings up a list of subcategories, while enter seems equivalent to clicking, opens the page for that top level category. Do you know if functional distinctions like this between space and enter is a relatively typical convention, or do you find that it varies quite a lot? It can vary. I would say usually enter will sort of complete an action, take you to a link, take you to a new page, submit a form, whereas space is probably more likely to be used for things like opening a drop-down menu, that kind of thing. But it can vary, and technically, as long as you can do it in some way with the keyboard, then it will pass. Eugene says, I missed your comments on PDFs. How can I check whether they pass the accessibility requirements? So it's a bit like the question about websites. If you don't know if your PDFs are accessible, they probably aren't. There is PDF testing, free PDF testing software. Let me have a look in my bookmarks. Da, 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 da. See if I've got the right thing. Yep, there's the PAC PDF accessibility checker, which you can use. So you download it and drag your PDF onto it. And similar to the Microsoft Word accessibility checker, it'll give you a list of things that you need to consider. But PDFs can be very difficult to make accessible. It's easier to make the source document accessible and then turn that into a PDF. So if you've just received a PDF and you don't have the source document and it's inaccessible, it can be really very difficult to put that right. Okay, how's everybody doing? More questions? Throw them at me. Go for it. I feel like I've been talking a lot. If anybody would prefer to, do feel free to unmute and speak up. I don't think there's hundreds of us, so it wouldn't be too chaotic. Do I have a link to buttons on websites? How do you mean? What's the...
Hello.
Hello.
I thought it's easier just to speak.
Yep, go for it.
So we're trying to improve our website, and I've seen a lot of websites where you have a hovering button and you press it and it does some lovely accessible functions. Is there a great website you'd recommend that could install that? Do you have a favorite?
I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure what you mean.
I haven't got an example with me, but it's like symbols on the right or the left hand side. It's like a drop down menu, and then you hover on it, and it does these wonderful
I
things,
know
and
what you
they
mean. Yeah, yeah.
instantly make things bigger. And I haven't had a chance to investigate it thoroughly. And
Yes. So what you're talking about is an accessibility overlay. So this is quite a vexed
ah,
question in
thanks.
the accessibility field. So some people really like them, and often they're sold as, making your website accessible. Uh, and it's yeah. So there have been legal cases in the States around this, organizations claiming that these kind of products will make websites accessible when they don't. And in some instances, they can make the accessibility worse for people who use assistive technology. So I don't think there is one that I would necessarily recommend. They're not all dreadful. Some of them are probably okay. Um, but what we tend to focus on is for people to make sure that their website is just baseline accessible without those kind of overlays. So, for example, what the overlay will enable you to do is um, to increase the contrast on the website, to change the color scheme or something like that, or maybe to make the font bigger. But actually, you can do all of those things in your operating system. So, or in your browser settings. So what we prefer to do is to make sure that websites can accommodate when the user has set that in their settings. Uh, and also, I mean, sometimes people are not aware that you can actually do these things with their computers. So we also would encourage you to put information in your accessibility page about how to do that. So we've got a resource on the AbilityNet website called My Computer My Way, um, which is all about how to change your settings for you to make your computer easy to operate for you. So how can I go into my operating system and make all of my fonts a bit bigger? How can I implement like high contrast so that everything is, or dark mode, for example. Lots of people like dark mode, don't they? Partly because it saves battery on your phone, but also it can be a bit more restful on the eyes. But yeah, not everybody knows how to do this. So that's kind of the approach that we tend to take. It is a slightly controversial topic in accessibility, the question of overlays. I think sometimes it gives the impression of a website being accessible, when the reality may be that actually it isn't, if that
Thanks.
makes sense. So I'm not going to say that they're all, dreadful and you must never touch them, but there isn't really one that I would recommend for that reason. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Can I chip in on that one? I'm
Mm,
actually a software engineer myself, and I've recently done a piece working with British Airways and consultation with Nomensa. Um, a lot of the problem with those overlays and things like that is that traditionally inline code will interfere with those overlays, so it won't fully apply to your website in the way that you're expecting it to. There is a lot of audits to remove code like that and to stop those things from interacting with plugins, but a lot of old websites still have that inline code, which means even if you implement one of those overlays, it won't have the effect that you're expecting on your website if you've got old code in there. So that's something to factor in when you're trying to add it retrospectively.
So I think Bryony had her hand up earlier and then gave up. Did you want to ask something?
Um, I did, but then I realised I couldn't think how to phrase it. It was around the start of your presentation, which thank you, this has all been really helpful. But it's about once you're kind of starting it on our shoestring and you've kind of got the basics down and you've done the checks that you can, it's about then kind of taking it to the next level from that shoestring to trying to get some bootlaces out of the senior management to fund you for the next step.
Mm.
Apologies, Lydia. That was probably not very easy to translate.
Uh, it's a good question. Yeah, well, I think that, as I was saying, doing that kind of user testing can be really helpful with actual video of people trying and failing to use your website, that kind of thing. Um, that's a really good hearts and minds effort. Um, yeah, perfecting your elevator pitch. Um, I'm not sure I necessarily would be able to tell you how to, uh, change the minds of senior management from the bottom up, but that was certainly being able to actually demonstrate that people have these issues with your website is a good starting point.
No, thank you. I think that's a good point with actual videos, hearts and minds. I think we get quite caught up in black and white statistics. I was able to get statistics to show kind of from the National Office of Statistics in the UK how many people working age adults, I think it's about 23%
Yeah.
will have a disability in their life, and then using internal kind of employee surveys to try and pull data out, being aware that not everyone declares and they don't have to disclose.
Mm.
But I think, as you're saying, the hearts and mind piece about going, look, this is actually what happens for our customers, this is what happens for our employees, and they are struggling. They're very capable people, but we've not given them the reasonable adjustments and the technology they need to do their job.
This is a good answer from Vicky here, going through the company strategy and map how accessibility can deliver KPIs and objectives, helps with buy-in. That sounds like a really good idea. Has anybody
That's
else
good, Chef. Thank you.
got any suggestions, or any further questions for that matter?
I was just just going to add on it that when talking to stakeholders, be aware that they might not know what you're talking about. So make sure that you start with the definition. Somebody earlier was talking about definitions and understanding, and making sure that they understand the impact of it. And that helps to get the buy-in when they realise that it's not just about WCAG, it's not just about the check boxes, that it will make them money, it will help with internal workforce issues, and just trying to speak their language, it really helps. But I would say starting to try and get them on an even playing field of understanding before trying to influence them.
Thank you.
I mean, I think one of our jobs as accessibility consultants is, I always say it's about, 50% giving information and 50% just inspiring and making people want to get on board and do accessibility and sort of understanding the nuance as well. Anybody else got any more questions? Just looking to see if anyone's got their hand up. I mean, as I say, this was an incredibly whistle-stop tour through basically the whole of accessibility for an organisation. And it really comes from my experience in working in organisations of very small organisations where you've got sort of 5 to 10 people trying to do everything. And there is an awful lot more depth to be gone into. So all of these topics, so making website content accessible, document accessibility, multimedia, social media, all of these things we've got webinars in which go into an awful lot more depth. So if any of those are of particular interest, it's well worth having a look at those. Anybody else? Any more questions? No? Okay, well, I think we can probably wrap up and have a break before the next session, which I forget what it is.
Thanks all.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody much for attending.
Thanks very much.
Enjoy the rest of the day.